I don't know if we even have to put it in terms of higher and lower. I think it's more about concentricity, right? The idea of concentric centers that connote differing roles. Ultimately, kedusha is about separateness and specialness and distinction that takes a subset of a group or a subset of a thing and sets it aside for a designated alternate purpose. And there isn't anything that automatically raises that thing above the other things that it's separated from, but that it rather is about the relationship between the separated kadosh thing and that which it is separated from, and that together they form a whole that can be something together that it couldn't be if everything was equivalent. So it's not as much about inequality, let's say, as non-equivalence. And you can see that with any example of Kedusha that you can think of in Torah. Shabbat is a Yom Kadosh. It's a time that is Kadosh. It is set apart from the rest of the week. It is one day out of seven that is separate and special and different. And it is not easy, I think, to make the case somehow that the Torah regards Shabbat as somehow the goal, like that we just wish the world would just be Shabbat, because we get the creation of the world from all the other days. There's something very productive about the other days. And the Torah doesn't just say rest on Shabbat, it says on the other days you're supposed to do melacha. You're supposed to do crafts, you're supposed to create things and do things. And so I don't think you would say because Shabbat has a specialness that the other days are worthless or pointless or serve no purpose, but they clearly can't serve the same purpose as Shabbat, and they are redeemed or made more worthwhile by the existence of Shabbat, because without Shabbat, without a day that is set aside for the designation of cementing our relationship with our Creator, we're just talking about days of toil with no meaning and with no connection to anything more elevated, meaning Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And so that's one example. Eretz Yisrael is another one. And now we have a lot of concentricity, right? Because you have Eretz Yisrael is kadosh with respect to the rest of the world, and then Yerushalayim is kadosh with respect to Eretz Yisrael, and then Har HaBayit is kadosh with respect to the rest of Yerushalayim, and then even within Har HaBayit, even within the Mishkan, you have these layers, right? Like the Kodesh Kodashim at the very center is a bounded region that you don't enter as frequently as other parts of what you create as a mikdash on Har HaBayit for the purpose of avodah. So there are places that the Kohanim are going on a normal day in the mikdash that are more everyday kind of mikdash, and then there's Kodesh Kodashim, where the Kohen Gadol, who's the most kadosh of the Kohanim, only goes there on one day of year. And then we can talk about people, right? There's Am Yisrael are kadosh with respect to the rest of humanity, and then the Levim are separated from the rest of Am Yisrael, and the Kohanim are separated from the Levim, and the Kohen Gadol is separated from the Kohanim. And in each of those cases, I think you have to reject the simplicity of Korach's mistake, right? Korach, when Korach is accusing Aaron and Moshe, and he's rejecting the kiddusha of the Kohanim with respect to the Levim, it says, "Kahalu al Moshe wa ala Aaron wa yomeru alehim rav lachem ki chol ha'eda kulam kedoshim uvtocham Adonai umadua titnasu al kehal Adonai." Right? Why do you lift yourselves up above the congregation? But the claim that Aaron and Moshe are lifting themselves up is part of Korach's mistake. It's not that they are higher or better. It's that there's a kedusha that the Kohanim are being given that the Levim don't have, or that Am Yisrael don't have in general. But I think if you make a fair accounting of things, looking at these concentric circles of humanity, there's kinds of people who would maybe choose to be on either side of any of those boundaries, saying, oh, I think they could say, like a Ben Noach could say, I'm very glad we have Am Yisrael to be a Mamlechet Kohanim. I'm glad that we have the nation of Israel to be a kingdom of priests so that they can teach Torah to the world and we can all relate to Hashem. But there are things I'd like to do with my life that I would not be permitted to do if I had to keep the Torah. And actually, it's not obvious that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants all of humanity to keep the Torah. He may, in fact, want some of humanity to keep the Torah and some of humanity to learn about that from Am Yisrael, but to just relate to him as Bnei Noach, who don't have to keep the Torah, and as a result might be permitted to do a bunch of things that we can't do as Jews keeping the Torah. And then that works also for Kohanim inside Am Yisrael, right? Like it's more obvious in some sense. To be a Kohen in the Torah is very double-edged. You get an income of food, so that sounds like a good deal, right? People are always giving you their agricultural products, but it's not for free because you're supposed to teach Torah and you're supposed to work in the avodah of the Mikdash. And also you don't get a nachla, you don't get land that you inherit as a matter of your tribal right. And so there are these advantages and disadvantages, and it's just a different package deal. And I don't think you just say, oh, well, of course I would want to be a Kohen whose family life is much more restricted by all the requirements of Tuma and Tahara, where I can't eat this free food that I'm getting unless I'm in a state of Tahara, but then I have to go to the mikveh and I have to worry a lot more about all these things that are Mekabel Tuma and everything, right? That to some people would sound like a straitjacket, the same way that the mitzvot of the Torah that all observant Jews keep might sound like a straitjacket to someone else who still could say, but I totally acknowledge that Hashem made the world and that he is king and that we should follow his laws. But those 613 mitzvot are not for me. So I think, it has to be said emphatically that Kedusha is not about inequality in some kind of level of power or level of worth or level of benefit, but it is about separation of part of the whole in order to give the reunited whole a new kind of meaning that wasn't possible without that separation and distinction achieved through law. And we see that in time, we see that in space and land, we see that in people. And obviously, the hardest thing for people to wrap their heads around in the present day is the idea of this with people, because the principles on which societies, let's say like the United States, are based, see the complete political and civic equivalence of all individuals as an absolute necessity, to such a degree that in a sense you could say that is the American religion, as it has kind of developed over time. And it's a very hard thing coming from that perspective to understand what it means to say, we're going to make distinction between these two groups of people in a way that's reflected in law, albeit a religious law, but a law that has real implications in terms of perhaps land and inheritance and other things that you can't disentangle politics from. We're going to make these distinctions, and it's not in order to oppress someone or in order to purely benefit someone else, but it's because the creator of the world commands us to recognize that distinction and to create it in our behavior so that we can achieve things in our relationship to him that aren't possible if we just have one big circle with every point having an equivalent relationship to the center. And so that in the present day has to be, a very delicate discussion and a thoughtful one, but obviously one where those bearing the standard of Torah have to be very firm and say, I'm not going to just say because Thomas Jefferson wrote something that we have to throw half the Torah out the window because it doesn't sound right to someone who isn't listening closely, looking at it closely, and understanding its implications carefully.
Maybe as the redemption process advances, there will be progress made in terms of the Gentile nations themselves and realizing what their own destinies and purposes are. In the same way that the Jews ultimately are going to understand what their purpose is. And perhaps it's reasonable to imagine that other nations will also, once we get to a situation where all the world sort of sees the need for mutual respect among the nations in the spirit of service of Hashem, there'll be an ability for the nations to figure out what their role is, and that perhaps it makes a lot more sense than the situation nowadays where nationhood is sort of discouraged and there's never any sense of difference among the nations. Everybody's just the same. And again, like you're saying, not a question of being higher or lower, just a question of we have a beautiful world of difference, many different types of nations that can serve different functions in the service of Hashem.
I think it's a beautiful idea, and I think that there's quite real support for it in the example of what we just talked about with Korach, because when Moshe is asking all the tribes to lay down their staves in some kind of contest to show that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses Aharon as the representative of the tribe of Levi in order to be the leadership of the priesthood, they lay down their staves, and Aaron's staff blossoms with shkedim, right? There's the flowers of the almond, and the almonds are growing on his staff miraculously. And we sometimes look at that and say, okay, almonds are nice. There's some almond-shaped things in the Mishkan. So we see almond trees growing here in the land of Israel. It's just some local color, and move on. But what's the point of that? What is known about shkediot, about almond trees? What do we know even from the modern state of Israel's cultural production surrounding Tu B'Shvat? The song Hashkedia Porachat V'Shemesh Bazorachat, right? That Tu B'Shvat, which is at the very beginning of the season when fruiting trees begin to flower, is kicked off with the flowering of the almond trees, because the almond trees flower early. And so the point is, from that perspective, the flowering of the staff of Aaron is not saying Aaron's staff gets flowers and the rest of you get none because you don't matter. It's saying Aaron's staff flowers first. And I love the version of this that you're recognizing at the international level, because here we're talking about Aaron, and it's like saying Levi and Aaron have figured out their purpose first, right? So they have discovered a relationship to Hashem that they need to have, and then we can all benefit from that they figured that out. Because the role of Shevet Levi was in part to teach Torah to the rest of the nation. But the rest of the Shvatim can also figure out what they're for, right? Oholiav is from Shevet Dan, and he played this key role in building the Mishkan. So he had a role to play also in serving Hashem. And he was from a different tribe. And other tribes as well might kind of figure out what their identity is about. But that also is something that we can now talk about in terms of Mamlechet Kohanim, right? If we think of Am Yisrael as Mamlechet Kohanim, that we're this nation of priests, there is a way of understanding that as saying we're the ones who figured out how to have proper relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu first. And that's that's a statement that carries a lot of asterisks, because there's a huge amount of criticism that Tanakh itself brings to bear for the attempts we made at having relationship with Hashem. And you could lay even more criticism at the feet of Am Yisrael in the present day for how well we're doing by that scorecard in our current relationship. But in principle, at least we're still the custodians of the message of how to do things right. But that doesn't mean other nations can't figure out what their purpose is. It just means we're supposed to help them to. Hashem says about Am Yisrael, B'ni B'chori Yisrael, that Yisrael is like his firstborn. So what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to be the firstborn? It means you're born first, so you're older, so you're being taught the proper way to behave first in the family. You're learning the rules, and you become a standard bearer who teaches the rules to others. But ultimately, that doesn't mean everyone becomes a slave to the Ben Bechor, or it doesn't mean everyone has to be identical to the Ben Bechor. And I think it's a beautiful idea, a very exciting idea to imagine that the redemption that Am Yisrael are experiencing in the recent century and future ones, B'ezrat Hashem, it's a moment for humanity to forge a new relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Am Yisrael, but that ultimately could lead to a lot of discoveries of how to relate to Hashem that we don't know about, because it's for them to figure out, and it's not the job of Am Yisrael to fill in all of those details, but rather to sort of provide guidance about how to seek relationship in a proper way, and then other nations can figure out what that ultimately will consist of for them.
This reminds me of a parallel on the individual level that I've seen this both in different types of commentaries where Jews are encouraged to, on the one hand, judge themselves according to their fulfillment of the law. And there's another standard, judge themselves on the basis of, am I fulfilling my personal function and purpose in this world? As an individual. In other words, yes, every one of us Jews are commanded to fulfill the laws as they're contained in the Torah. But on top of that, there's a concept, I don't know what you think about this idea, and I don't know whether this idea is a mandatory idea, but I've seen this repeatedly, this concept that even when I even read this in some Torah related to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where it was saying that we have to think about not only whether we're fulfilling the law, as I said, but are we fulfilling our personal function, our personal purpose in this world? So maybe this also relates to the Gentiles, that they could look at themselves on one level as the whole world. Am I being a good person? Am I fulfilling the basic rules of moral decency, the Noahide laws? That's one level. And then there's another level of, are we fulfilling our nation's destinies and purposes?
Yeah, I certainly think you see that at the individual level in Torah. Whether you try to build it up from the idea of Ha'olam nivra bishvili, like the world is created for me, which originates in the Talmud as more like a halachic concept that allows you to make decisions on the basis of your own perspective, but I think contains a broader idea as well, that at some level, everything you're perceiving, you can think of as HaKadosh Baruch Hu presenting to you a set of choices and opportunities. And when you focus on your relationship with him being mediated by everything the world that you perceive consists of, then yeah, it seems like there's a lot of additional expressiveness in the particular choices that you make of how to serve him, rather than just saying, oh, there must be just one way to serve him correctly, because the truth is, of course, that's an impossibility. The idea that there's a perfect way of serving Hashem that's the same for everyone, or even that you could know the perfect way that's particular to you. In fact, what you always encounter is seeming sets of contradictions where you have choices to make about compromises. And so even just because of that, you're really always kind of putting your unique mark on your attempt at serving Hashem correctly. I'd also say, I think we mentioned this before, that when the tribes are arrayed for blessing and curse on Har Gerizim and Har Eval, that there's this curious switch that's made where you have on associated with the bracha and Har Gerizim, you have all the brothers, or the tribes descended from all the brothers or all the sons of Yaakov, who actually have narrative roles to play in Sefer Bereshit, except for Reuven. Reuven is switched with Yisachar, right? If you switch Yisachar with Reuven, then for the bracha and Har Gerizim, you would have Reuven, Levi, Shimon, and Yosef, Yehuda, and Binyamin. Binyamin doesn't play a very big narrative role, but insofar as he was accused of a crime he didn't commit, he made the choice of not committing the crime, and that is a choice that we see playing a significant role in the story. Reuven is talked about at various points, but he's not there because some of what's talked about with him is that he did something wrong, like this curious episode that's referred to where he sort of ascended to the couch of his father's wife. But Yisachar is there to represent Reuven. Why? Because Reuven brought his mother the Dudaim, these plants that he was gathering, and he gave a gift to his mother. He's talked about as doing something, like an actual choice that he made, where it's not clearly the kiyum of any particular mitzvah. According to the Torah, he's just being a person, making choices, doing things. And Yisachar was born as a result of the union between Leah and Yaakov that happens after that moment. So Yisachar stands for Reuven and stands for maybe a positive thing that Reuven did in his life. We don't hear anything about Yisachar, anything that in choice he made, anything he did. Same thing for Zvulun, same thing for Dan, same thing for Naphtali, or Asher. So the other six brothers are not characters. They're just names. And then they produce tribes, and things come from those tribes, and that's, eventually we hear some stories about that. And for the klala, for the curse, for Har Eval, for those tribes that we hear nothing about their stories, that you also have associated with these like plaster plinths with mitzvot written on them. So there's this sense of, okay, if you want to be a robot, here's some instructions for you. You can be nothing except the mitzvot, but then you're associated with the possibility of transgression and the curse that may result from that. But if we're going to talk about bracha, then let's talk about the unique personalities of individuals who lived and they made choices, and not every choice they made was sort of punch card or choose your own adventure kind of situation where it's, do you want to perform a mitzvah correctly or perform it incorrectly? Do you want to, do an avera or not do an avera? People face much murkier choices very often, or some choices that seem to be neutral, but they still kind of have to paint in that empty space and make a choice about what to do today, which sometimes includes things that we don't immediately realize, what are the implications of this for Avodat Hashem, even if we should be trying to. So I think the point is absolutely, along the lines of what you're saying, that at the individual level, and I think it's quite interesting what you're suggesting at the national level as well, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to give blessing to those who really show individual personality and creativity in the relationship that they seek with him through their choices. And obviously that has to be within the guardrails of the things Hashem requires us to do and the things he forbids us from doing. But there's still a tremendous freedom and an infinity of possibility within that space. And there are those who will take hold of that infinity and say, here's how I should leave my mark. I will be bocher b'chaim. I will choose life. I'll be a unique living creature that seeks what it desires within the bounds of what is permitted, and seeks relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way that expresses an individual personality. And it seems like that's something HaKadosh Baruch Hu is encouraging at the individual level, certainly, but I think it's very hard to argue against that same principle applying at the national level as well.
if we don't believe in these principles, then it's kind of sad to think about what a bland world we will have. If everything is just, well, follow the technical laws of in other words, not the chas v'shalom being derisive regarding the need to fulfill the seven Noahide laws. But I'm saying that to imagine a world that's very monochromatic and we're not going to be, as the Gula advances, not seeing differences among the nations themselves and how they advance in their Avodat Hashem on the foundation of the seven Noahide laws. If we don't see that possibility, I think that it's very hard to envision a world which is not very bland.
I agree, and I think this is an underappreciated point in the Jewish world, or even in this, let's say, whatever you want to call it, the Torah world, in the sense that partly because of Galut, to a very significant degree, Am Yisrael, in our self-definition and our relationship to Torah, we have been focused on our own responsibilities and our survival, and haven't given much thought to what we're supposed to be for the rest of humanity and what that's supposed to lead to. And this is now a new era where that's something people can start to put thought into. And so the notion of what is the Judaic idea of what hopes we have for the rest of humanity, that's a very underdeveloped idea, where there's a lot of blank space, waiting to be filled with the positive imaginings of people with hopes and aspirations that are guided by Torah. And so that, I think that is an interesting discussion to frame. But I would add, because you're touching on something else that I think is an equally interesting and important thing to get to, which is, even if we just focus on what Am Yisrael are supposed to do, this is a question that I've asked myself a lot over the years, that there seems to be this kind of paradox where, on the one hand, if you try to imagine yourself choosing to do something where you say, I'm going to do the things that I'm supposed to do according to the Torah, and I won't do the things I'm not allowed to do, and then that's supposed to leave me with these remaining degrees of freedom where now I can just do whatever I want, and that will have nothing to do with serving Hashem, right? It'll just be whatever I feel like, right? There seems to be something wrong with that attitude, right? Because the mitzvah, v'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol meodecha, right? That you should love Hashem with all of your heart, and not even heart, but your hearts, im shnei yitzrecha, with all of your inclinations, and with all of your nefesh, which I think soul is maybe a poor translation of nefesh, but with your whole being and more and more, bechol meodecha, that if you're gonna love Hashem that way, I don't think you can say you quite have met that bar if you're kind of looking to draw dotted lines to make sure that you're fully on track with doing what the rule book says, but then beyond that, you're saying, all right, this is my break time. Like, this is for me. This isn't for Hashem anymore. To some degree, we have to allow for a bit of that, in the sense that we're animal creatures. To some degree, we have passions and inclinations, and there is something very beautiful about the freedom the Torah gives us to say, look, if you can control your inclinations to this degree, then there's a way of enjoying fulfillment of those inclinations within those boundaries that can be kadosh, and that can be a great simcha that you deserve to have because you're serving Hashem correctly. And yet, when you describe it too much in the extreme, it sounds disturbing to imagine that you're going to somehow you're going to think of serving Hashem as being something that walls off possibilities or gives you a day job that you have to fulfill in serving Hashem in these. But once you've checked those boxes, Now it's all about you, and the cycles will go round and round, and that will just keep on happening, and the smoke will go up. And what will be the point of that, right? It also sounds somehow too simple and too monotonous and methodical and cyclical, and therefore perhaps kind of anesthetized. And so I think in both extremes, there's something kind of puzzlingly inadequate. And I don't know if I have full resolution to the question, but I think it is something that's worth thinking about and trying to study, what the Torah has to teach us about this question. And I think so far, provisionally, maybe the understanding I would claim you can get from the text is that there are some things in the Torah that the Torah asks you to do that have implications for this question. Like I was mentioning before, Bar-Hayim, you should choose life, or Bar-Hayim, you should live according to the Torah. That really, to do that, you need to think about what it means to be alive and what a living thing is. And all the examples of living things that we have, they have particularities and desires and inclinations and appetites. And to be alive and to act like a living thing is not to live in the total annihilation or extirpation or elimination of those inclinations or appetites. It's to bound to them and to channel them, certainly, but not to succeed in removing them from the framework with which you ever decide to do anything. And I think what's also true is that the avodah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands us is not about pulling us away from this world and pulling us into some extremely narrow and limiting set of activities that have to do with only a few things, but rather it's about bringing the Shekhinah into an infinity of things that we get involved with doing, right? That it's about agriculture, and it's about family life cycle events, and it's also about markets and transactions and money, and it's also about astronomy, and when you add it all up, there are aspects of Avodat Hashem and aspects of Torah that pertain to everything. And all the more so when you have a Mikdash, where there's a whole agricultural economy that's connected with that. There's an arts and crafts economy. There's all sorts of different things, kinds of mistakes that people are making that they have to atone for, and things they have to learn about how to do correctly. There's all of that is being brought together in a place where there's kind of this festival atmosphere that people can participate in various ways. They can eat there. It's like a farm-to-table restaurant, right? There's a whole lot that it consists of, where you feel like if everyone's doing that and they're doing it right, that won't mean that everything is straitjacketed. It will mean that everything is like an engine for producing endless possibility of new occurrences that cause different people to be drawn in new directions, and to find new opportunities to make their unique mark, because they are in some sense following their appetites, but where they can kind of simultaneously be asking themselves, what does Hashem want me to be doing here? And the answer isn't already written down in this pasuk, and yet we have the discernment to understand that this is what he's asking us to do because of all the Torah that we've studied, because of the way that we've shaped the world that we inhabit to be full of that signage and to be full of that meaning. And then there's this whole other realm of infinite possibility that's unlocked, where there's like a lot more he wants us to do, and we'll be better equipped, not just we, Am Yisrael, but we, humanity, will be better equipped to figure it out, because we know how to listen and get the message.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.